Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and I want to thank all of you for joining us throughout the years. We've been broadcasting this show since 2004, so it's 20 years ago. It's an honor to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. Now, um, as you know, how could you not know? Elections took place 1 week ago. And even though there was a sense, or by most analysts, that the likely new president for Mexico would be Claudia Sheinbaum, I have to say there is, among analysts, there has been, and I would even say the political parties, even the opposition parties, it was kind of a shock to see how much the new president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, won. It appears that she won with 60% of, or close to 60% of the vote. And this really has to be put into context as to what does it mean, not only that we have a woman president, but in terms of how Mexican politics has changed in the last 24 years. I am delighted to present to you today's guest. She is a professor that I met in ITAM 24 years ago, more than 24, yes, 24 years ago, when President Vicente Fox was elected. He became the first president of what is called the transition period, where the PRI would no longer be governing. And now Pamela, oh, by the way, Pamela Starr is a professor at the University of Southern California and senior advisor at Monarch Strategy. Pamela, 24 years later, we have a woman president, and we have clearly what is considered to be, because she's not belonged to any other party except parties from the left side of the political spectrum. She's clearly a woman, a politician that comes from the left side of the political spectrum. Welcome to the show. Your initial reactions when we compare it to what you and I lived through 24 years ago. Welcome to the show, Pamela.
Thank you, Ana Maria. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Um, you know, my initial reaction is that it's a reflection on how unable Mexican democracy was to be able to reach the majority of people. We were all so excited when Mexico democratized 24 years ago, thinking that this would be a country that not only now would allow for free and fair elections and free speech and more access ideally to the judicial system, but also would be a country that wouldn't be just for this small political economic elite, but would have a broader impact on society. What we discovered 24 years later is it was the same political and economic elite that was leading the country. And as a result, to a certain extent, they led democracy into the ground and created an opening for somebody like Manuel Lopez Obrador and his chosen successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, to take over politics and move the country in a different direction. And I would argue a good direction socioeconomically, bringing in a sector of society that hadn't been involved before. But unfortunately, they're also doing it with a lot of democratic backsliding, which is frustrating after having worked for 24 years, or actually in 18 years in Mexico, to try to really solidify democratic institutions.
You know, there's been this ongoing debate about how do you convince the voters that democracy is good for them if they don't feel it directly. So, a lot of us have been kind of commenting in the last couple of days that, if the success of these programs, of these social programs based on cash, they directly receive cash, has been part of the success. I'm not going to say it's been all of the success that reflects in these results. But I think people, in general, we have done a bad job in trying to convince the checks and balances, the importance of having an independent court, the importance of having some independence from the legislative branch, the transparency, this extraordinary effort 20 years ago. You remember that, trying to create an institute that was independent and that assured transparency of all the, most of the actions or decisions made by government. And it just is not being reflected in this what happened on Sunday.
Yeah, I think there are three things in my mind that went wrong under democracy in Mexico. That the result was that a big segment of the population, if not the majority, didn't feel it was anything different really than what came before it. Part of it was the fact that um, the judiciary was reformed at the upper levels,
Right.
but there was no reform that made the judiciary more accessible to everyday people. They still have no access to the legal system. So that wasn't changed for them. Second, socioeconomically, they didn't feel anything. And I would actually argue that more important than the social programs has been the rise in the minimum wage. Actually, the minimum wage commission came out with a fact the other day that was rather eye-opening. They said of the 5 million people pulled out of poverty under Lopez Obrador, 4.1 were due to the change in the minimum wage, not to social programs. That's something that any government could have done. But instead, you had governments that were trying to keep Mexico competitive on the basis of low wages. And finally, you had an attitude in the political class that was inherited from the past, which was basically the sense of people don't know what's best for them.
Right.
We know what's best for them. And so we don't need to listen to them. We'll just do what's best for them and they will appreciate it. And I think that combination simply didn't work. And these last two elections at the presidential level have demonstrated that.
So I guess it raises a question, and this is going to sound very rhetoric, but will democracy survive in Mexico? I mean, I hate to ask the question that way because maybe we are transversion to a different type of democracy. But what is your vision of what potentially could happen in the next 6 years?
Well, if we're talking about liberal democracy, which is a democracy that's based on institutions and rules and procedures, that's definitely is going to suffer a bit of a backlash. Lopez Obrador and Sheinbaum, neither one of them support democracy in that fashion. They both believe that those institutions were designed to make a democracy of the elite, by the elite, for the elite. Whether they're right or wrong, that's what they think. And they have a different conception of democracy. For them, democracy isn't about processes and procedures and institutions. It's about outcomes. It's about socioeconomic outcomes. True democracy delivers for the people. It's not about your ability to express your opinion, to be able to vote, to be able to have some sort of accountability in politicians. It's rather politicians delivering. And that's not what we think of when we think of liberal democracy. I don't suspect that we're going to move forward on liberal democracy under Scheinbaum. I suspect there'll be more backsliding, particularly in the judicial branch. But the question is, can Mexico revive a liberal democracy in the future, but one that serves the interests of the entire population as opposed to an important segment of the population?
So I have to ask you because I know that this is your expertise is on the bilateral relations between Mexico and the United States. Could you just kind of briefly walk us through how this relationship has changed in the last 24 years since President Vicente Fox was elected, and just kind of focus on what do you think is the future of the bilateral relationship?
Sure. The relationship historically, up until Vicente Fox, was always one of Mexico keeping the United States at arm's length, and the United States agreeing to that. I
Mhm.
referred to this relationship as one of Mexico had autonomy, but within limits. It could pretty much do whatever it wanted to in foreign policy and domestic policy, as long as it didn't threaten US national security. And what the United States defined as US national security changed over time, and it changed with administrations. But pretty much there was a realm within Mexico understood as long as it was a loyal ally of the United States, it had flexibility elsewhere and could keep the United States at a distance. With the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico couldn't do that anymore because it now was becoming increasingly dependent on the United States economically. The three Democratic presidents, Fox, Calderon, and Peña Nieto, led a what became more of an embrace of the United States. In continued cooperation on the economy, increased cooperation on security matters, and cooperation increasingly on migration matters as well, where the two countries became, they thought of themselves more as partners, as more as equals in the relationship. Lopez Obrador and a good segment of society was never comfortable with that because there was a lack of trust, given the power differential between the United States and Mexico. And it's that historical power differential that's always made Mexico a little mistrustful of the United States. Then along came Donald Trump, which reminded Mexico the United States can do whatever it wants to, whenever it wants to, including using the economic relationship to coerce Mexico to cooperate on migration in particular, but also on security. That experience, I think, reinforced the pre-existing concern in a Lopez Obrador, in a Morena, and now in a Claudia Sheinbaum, is that the United States can never be fully trusted. Yes, we have to collaborate with the United States. Mexico must work with its partner, but it always must do so with its eyes wide open because the United States is a great power and can use its power to push Mexico around if it chooses to do so. So I think we're back to where we were before Vicente Fox, but with a relationship that, due to circumstances, is much, much closer than it ever was before. But it's going to be a relationship consistently punctuated by conflict as Mexico tries to protect its national sovereignty from the United States.
Now, when I've been interviewed and I've been participating in some panels and done a series of interviews since the elections last weekend, when they ask me about the what is the future of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States, I always go back to we've got to figure out what's going to happen in November and who is going to be the next president, whether it's going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. But in the last 2 days, I have to say, and with this decision by President Biden to kind of issue this memorandum, kind of exercising more control, who comes into the United States through the Mexican border, I'm starting to realize, I think, and this, I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say, is that, the relationship towards the future is not going to be that different. I don't know, I may be wrong, regardless of who is the next president of the United States, either Biden or Trump, simply because the immigration issue has become, it seems to be on the forefront of the priorities for the United States.
I agree with what you're saying, but then I'm going to disagree a little bit because you're absolutely right. Migration matters to the US population. It matters regardless if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Democrats are more supportive of migration than the Republican political bases, but both of them are concerned about the numbers that are coming in without documentation. But Donald Trump is a totally different animal from Joe Biden. The Biden administration is one that is predictable. Mexico knows where it stands. It knows the rules of the road, and it knows how to utilize that relationship to get the most out of it for Mexico. Donald Trump is going to be a different kind of president, I think, if he were to get a second presidency from his first. He's always unpredictable, so there's always that to deal with. I think given his very nature and the way he sees women, he is going to test Claudia Sheinbaum early and aggressively to see if she really has the mettle that he can respect. And he is prone to use the power of the United States to coerce Mexico, as opposed to negotiating as a partner. He sees Mexico as a not as a partner, but as an inferior ally that he can push around. Now, whether or not Sheinbaum can come to an agreement with a Trump the way that Lopez Obrador did, I'm not certain, because the people that created that relationship for Lopez Obrador, meaning Marcelo Ebrard on the Mexican side and Jared Kushner on the US side, aren't there. And Kushner isn't going to be part of a second Trump presidency. So can you reestablish that dialogue? And finally, Sheinbaum isn't a populist. That's not who she is. Lopez
Right.
Obrador and Trump are the same kind of political animal, and they could create a mutual bond based on that. And I think that's not going to work for President Sheinbaum. So, as you say, I think the issues will be the same, but how we go about dealing with the issues and how that impacts the nature of the bilateral relationship will be very different under President Trump than under President Biden.
Dr. Pamela Starr, it's been wonderful to see you again, to talk to you again, and hopefully you'll be joining us frequently here on Living in Mexico Radio, because it's going to be interesting times, both in Mexico and in the United States, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this works out eventually, especially if how Mexico's democracy has changed since the year 2000. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining us, Dr. Pamela Starr. She is a professor at the University of Southern California, and she's also a senior advisor at Monarch Strategy. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
We're gonna go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Don't go away. I'll be right back.